Now, what's very interesting here is that this has been at no small cost. Cost in terms of blood and treasure. We've lost a lot of soldiers' lives in going to America's wars. We've spent literally billions of dollars in going to America's wars. And the question that Henry Reynolds, in a book called Unnecessary Wars, the question he has asked is, what objectives have been achieved in sending Australia's troops into America's wars? Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, for example. All of these very expensive in all sorts of ways. What are the objectives that we have achieved? And if we look at it in terms of, for example, fighting communism in Vietnam, fighting the spread of communism in the Korean Peninsula, if we look at it in terms of building democracy in Iraq, saving the Hazaras and all the others in Afghanistan, if we look at it in terms of particularly protecting the well-being of civilians in Syria, we have not achieved one single objective in any of those conflicts. Not one. Indeed, Vietnam was certainly a defeat for America and for us. The Korean War was a stalemate and still is, and it's a very tragic situation that we see there. Nonetheless, Australians, I think, believe that the signal most important objective is that we have demonstrated loyalty to the ANZUS Treaty, that we've shown America, through thick or thin, we will go with them into their wars. And sometimes it seems to me that we almost get to America's wars before America gets there. There is this sense that we really need to be doing it. So we pose sometimes as America's deputy sheriff in the Asia-Pacific region. We pose as America's cheerleader in the Asia-Pacific. Our defence materiel, a lot of our guns, our equipment, military equipment and so on, is almost entirely now purchased and designed to make sure that it's, as the term is, interoperable with US military technology. And we have access, discounted access, to America's military technology and hardware and to American intelligence. And this is again seen as a payoff for our loyalty and our enthusiasm. We also, of course, have United States communications bases on Australian soil, the most significant of which is in the Northern Territory, Pine Gap, which is a vast communications base, which, amongst other things, is constantly eavesdropping on all of our Asian neighbours, spying in very sophisticated ways. But secondly, and this worries me most of all, it's a major director of drone warfare in Syria and in Afghanistan. And if you keep in mind that drones, these unmanned aircraft that are dropping bombs and waging war on enemies of the United States and its allies, have a very bad record when it comes to collateral damage. Civilian deaths are now roughly 3 times more than so-called military deaths as a direct result of drone warfare. I was at a seminar in 2014, not long before Malcolm Fraser died. And Malcolm Fraser was at the seminar at the University of Melbourne, and the presenter was I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, a very famous American international lawyer and international relations expert who has been one of the architects of the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague, a United Nations court, to which Australia is a signed-up member. And the purpose of that court is to arrest leaders of countries or politicians or other figures in countries where human rights violations are gross, and take them to The Hague and try them and sentence them if they're found guilty. Our speaker was one of the architects of this, and Malcolm Fraser stood up at the end of his talk and said, well, I'm interested in the court, I'm interested in the kinds of crimes that are being committed, and I think the court is a wonderful thing, Do you think, he asked, this is Fraser asking, do you think that if Australia is complicit in the deployment of drones killing civilians, are we therefore contravening international law? And the reply came straight back, yes, you are. Yes, Australia is complicit in this kind of activity, and that makes Australia's leaders vulnerable to being taken to the International Criminal Court. I look forward to that happening, to be honest. And I'd be very interested to know, for example, how John Howard, who took us into the war in Iraq without any parliamentary consultation, without any significant debate in this country, and as far as some constitutional lawyers are concerned, he did it unconstitutionally. Would we see John Howard brought up before the court? It would be an interesting problem for Australia if that were to happen. Unfortunately, the court's got all sorts of problems, and its major focus has been on brutal dictators in Africa, and I think it's got to broaden its things. We also, of course, have rotating Marines now through Darwin on a regular basis, who are all part of the containment of China policy of the United States. It's not an Australian policy per se, and Malcolm Turnbull was in Washington recently, and one of the announcements was that that rotation is going to be quite significantly increased in numbers. There will be possible further security cooperation in the wake of President Trump's agreement to delist Australia from his new import duties on steel and aluminium. And we don't yet know whether there is to be a security quid pro quo that we're going to be expected to do. Of course, these are the problems of the ANZUS Treaty. There are benefits, and I don't want to understate those. Certainly, the ANZUS Treaty has, to some extent, contributed to our security. If not to our actual security, to our sense of security. And I don't think people should be terrified all the time, but we should be a little less complacent, perhaps, than we have been. It's also made it possible for us to have massive savings in terms of our defence budget expenditures. We spend less than half of what we would have to do if we were actually defending ourselves on our own. And then, of course, there is the Australian sense that we have this important status, the Deputy Sheriff, cheerleader status, simply because we are a very close ally of the United States. Now, in the light of that kind of argument, or that kind of evidence, I want to suggest to you that Australia is a dependent middle power. Its influence is based on its alliance with the United States. It's not that we have substantive power and integrity of our own. It's very much because we are America's ally that we have any kind of claim to some kind of middle power status. So I want to ask the question then, does being a dependent middle power matter? Is it a problem? I think it is. As I've noted, it's very costly, first of all, in terms of blood and treasure. We are incredibly, strangely enthusiastic at going to America's wars. Moreover, it's kept Australia on the margins of its geopolitical location in Asia, contributing to what I've referred to in my book as awkward partnering in Asia.